Okay, so we're live, but we don't see you. So hi everyone. Write down on the chat if you can hear and see us, and everything runs smoothly. And if you want, you can also add where you're joining us from, just so we'll know. The chat is on your right side. Um, so let's make sure that everyone here and see us. Okay, I still don't see Abe from Austin. Abe, do you hear us and see everything okay? Hi. From Syracuse. Nice. Yes, okay. Cool. So we'll give a couple more minutes for people to join. Um, and we'll start in a second. Okay. Um, Perfect. So welcome to our fourth session of Prep Your Firm, where we put the emphasis on the topics, the tools, the knowledge that will get you a better start for 2026. One second here. If you want to sign up for future sessions, and we already added another one in November about digital marketing, you can click the link below and sign up to all of them. It's free, of course, and the goal here is to give you everything that you need to be ready for 2026. A few housekeeping rules before we start. This session will be recorded, and based on the feedback that we got from heard a lot of people in the previous sessions, we will upload it to YouTube, so it'll be accessible to everyone who would want to watch that, not to gate any of the value content that we deliver here. Like I said, there is a chat on the right side, so if you have any questions, feel free to write them out during the session, and we'll gather all of them, and Steve will address all of them at the end. And the reason why we're here today is because for the past year, we hear all the time about private equity, PE, and we hear that in conferences, we hear that at webinars, we hear that along with a lot of acquisitions of firms. But the truth is that there's more to this than just private equity. There's pros and cons for private equity, but there are other options. And for that, we have Steve today, who will walk us through uh, beyond, right? We call it beyond the private equity ecosystem, and a little bit dive deep into the in and outs and all the different alternatives and options. So, Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. I will be in the back end helping moderate everything, but the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Elad. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen. I won't bore you guys with this slide. It's just a quick background on who we are, why we're here, why we're sharing this material. Um, our team, myself included, um, our background consists of private equity, venture capital, entrepreneurship, operations, search funds, etc. Um, we had the experience to talk about these topics intentionally, but we built the Franklin Alliance to be a little bit different and kind of pull some of the best threads from some of these different areas. And I can kind of expound on that further, but um, effectively, we wanted to discard the parts that we felt were not the best fit for small business owners. And I'll expound on that. So, yeah, why are we here talking about private equity? Why has it become such a kind of buzzword in the industry? Well, some statistics for you all. So there's been $50 billion of new capital in the US from private equity into CPA firms since 2020. Massive amount. I'm sure, as some of you can see on the screen, there's some names here you recognize, right? Like Citron Cooperman, Sikich, right? Grant Thornton, and many others. So a quote that I can't take attribution for, but one of our strategic advisors, Alan Colton, shared, which is there's been more change taking place in the last 5 years than in the previous 135 years in the accounting industry. That includes things like PE money, the succession squeeze that's going on, severe hiring bottlenecks. We've all seen the statistics, right? For every 7 accountants exiting the industry, there's only 1 coming in, right? And then the pace of change with regard to technology, which is pretty, you know, pretty fast and impressive. If you're on, if you're nimble and willing to embrace it. So as they say, right, may you live in interesting times. I think this is a pretty interesting time in the accounting industry, and it's certainly filled with opportunities for people who embrace it. So we'll start by touching on why private equity likes accounting, and then we'll transition to more of an overall landscape coverage to kind of point out the different players, the pros and cons, how they contrast traditional private equity, and what the options are for small business accounting firm owners. Here's an overview that hits on the key tenets. We'll go through each of these in detail, but high level, it's a fragmented industry, meaning there's a lot of players. It's a large market. It's resilient. It's a need to have service, not a must. It's a need to have service, a must have service, not a nice to have service. There's industry tailwinds for consolidation, which I'll expound on. There's a playbook that helps accounting firms specifically, and then there's a valuation arbitrage, which again I'll double click on. So to start with the first, I said earlier that it's a fragmented industry. So as you can see on the slide, right, this is from a couple years ago. The number's even higher now, right? 90,000 roughly accounting services firms in the US. The big four, or the largest, right, firms in the US only make up a minority share of the total market. So as you see on the right here on the slide, right, Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, Ernst & Young represent, right, that aggregate about 20%. And the rest of the companies represent the rest of the market. So it's a massive kind of long tail of firms. And the reason that this represents an opportunity to private equity is because there's a lot of firms to acquire, right? A lot of firms to buy. And that's, that it's a checkbox, right, for PE. So the next kind of key tenet here is it's a growing market and it's stable. The slide says TAM, which refers to total addressable market. Effectively, as you can see on the slide, it's a massive market. In the US, you can see what is that 2025 number, 734 billion. It's growing at a pretty stable kind of growth rate. You can see that in the orange box. That's been the historical growth rate of just over 4%. The prospective kind of future looking growth rate is the same. It's a little higher. And then if you look at specifically on the left, if you look at service lines like, CAS, for example, or tax prep, you can see those kind of forecasted growth rates as well, which are stable. This is important because private equity likes stability and they like growth. So tailwinds for a consolidator. This has to do with the fact that not only is there a large kind of ecosystem of firms, a large number of firms in the US, there's also kind of a massive wave of succession. You can look at the statistics here on the slide. 57% of firms have, according to the survey, have noted the need for retirement in either the next, you can see the breakdown, but that 57% aggregate is within the next 3 to 5 years. We have that even more granularly kind of segmented as well. But effectively, there's a massive amount of firms that are in need of succession. And so that can represent an opportunity for someone with capital and with an interest in the space. We've seen that through transactions in the last several years. I mean, as I kind of highlighted on the first slide, there has been a massive amount of money that's come into the space, and the pace of transactions is pretty hot. And I think this is fueling it. This is partly kind of one of the variables fueling it. So there's a playbook that works, right? There's an attractive business proposition. Many um, kind of small business accounting firms have similar challenges and also represent similar opportunities. So some of those things are, cross-selling existing clients. For example, tax compliance clients or business owners that may need CAS work, or may need kind of proactive tax services, right? There's, an accountant is a center of trust for their clients, and so thus, offering additional services, normally is received well, um, if the accounting firm has the kind of um, the capacity to service additional work. So there's that. There's broadening services. There's investments into recruiting, as we talked about earlier. Recruiting is kind of a challenge in the space, right? There's kind of a dearth of there's a dearth of CPAs, um, and that is something that can be. It's not a panacea to say that a larger firm can recruit better, but it sure is true that a larger firm can throw more resources at recruiting than a small firm can, and they enjoy the economies of scale. So if you can kind of throw some recruiting resources, maybe you can help a smaller firm kind of recruit at a higher level, right? So there's that aspect of it. The technology is a massive one. There's been significant amount of capital invested in kind of the proliferation of AI for tax workflow, for binder building, for CAS, for audit, et cetera. So if you can implement kind of some of those technologies that maybe haven't really penetrated, kind of the smaller segment of the industry, there's a benefit to be had there. And then lastly, offshoring is another one. Smaller firms tend to maybe have less exposure to this than larger firms. So there's all of these kind of variables at play that um, represents a playbook that, if executed, can help represent growth levers for a firm. And this kind of expounds on the valuation arbitrage, which basically means smaller firms trade at um, smaller multiples than larger firms. So if you look here, you can see the list of kind of a bunch of the publicly known transactions in the space and the multiples that they trade at, ranging from 8x to 18, an average of 13 times cash flow. This is an EBITDA multiple, but EBITDA is just a proxy for cash flow. So let's just say, here, based on these transactions, it's an average of 13 times. Smaller firms that trade on an individual basis trade for averages of, let's say, 3 times cash flow or 4, right? Depending on what the multiples are. There's public data on this, so we can, we can see it for ourselves. But there's a play here to be had, which is if you can invest in smaller firms at the 3x cash flow multiple and create an infrastructure where they're all kind of operating together, there's a significant multiple arbitrage between the entry multiple of 3 and the exit multiple of 13 on average here. So that kind of runs through the why private equity is interested. So from here, we'll transition to kind of outlining what I highlighted earlier, which is who's the right partner, how do the partners differ from each other, and what are the key variables to consider as it relates to each type of investment partner, and how accounting firms can benefit from this dynamic nature that um, underscores kind of the industry right now. So there's a lot on this slide, admittedly, but it's one of the most important slides. The columns here on the right represent the types of acquirers or investment partners for accounting firms. So you'll see traditional partner structure, private equity, individual CPA acquirers, and the Franklin Alliance as an example of kind of a different model. And then on the left, you'll see key variables as it relates to what we think accounting firm owners care about as they consider a potential investment partner. Things like the valuation, control, culture, opportunity for upside, the deal dynamics, etc. We'll go through each one here, starting from the left, right? Traditional partner structure. This is a larger CPA firm looking to acquire a smaller firm, maybe in the region, right? It allows for the larger firm can pay, a fair price because there may be some overlap of resources. The larger firm can utilize its own internal resources, which provides for cost savings. So the synergies that are created um, allow for some removal of cost redundancies and the firm to pay a fair price for the acquisition. But kind of in tandem with that, there's also some, I would say, guardrails, some pretty strict guardrails on how these deals are often consummated. So the deal structure itself is pretty inflexible. There's not an opportunity for the target firm normally to roll equity and own a piece of equity, in the larger entity post transaction. Normally, there's not additional capital for growth, specifically for the smaller firm. Like the larger firm isn't acquiring additional firms and as add-on acquisitions for the smaller firm, right? They're subsuming the smaller firm into the larger firm. And I'm sure everyone on the call has seen or heard people that have seen regional firm acquisitions and how they kind of transpire. And it normally doesn't include flexibility. It normally doesn't include upside in terms of equity or control. There really isn't a degree of control in these types of transactions. The smaller firm that's being acquired normally has to subscribe to, the the technology stack, the work from home policies, all of the policies, right? Uh, Basically you're subsumed into the larger firm completely, and so there isn't like a maintenance of the legacy and the culture and the systems of the small firm, which sometimes can result in kind of a cultural imbalance as well. Brand, in some cases, we've heard that clients like to be under the impression that their accountant now has more resources as being part of a larger firm, which maybe could be a benefit. But I think that also is counteracted by the fact that if the culture really changes and there's less kind of personal touch, then it can really be a detriment. So overall, that's kind of like the traditional acquisition regional firm acquiring a smaller firm. So now the next column here on the right is a private equity acquisition. So normally, just to set the foundational context here, normally private equity firms are looking to partner with accounting firms, right? They're looking to invest in accounting firms that are a little bit larger, and normally, $10 million of revenue on the low end, to $100 million, right, or higher. Um, Normally, like sub 10 million, for example, is not kind of the ideal strike zone, I would say, for traditional private equity. And so if you are in that strike zone, I think private equity would either view you as riskier, in which case that would impact the valuation, or they would view your firm as an add-on to a regional firm that they own, right? Which would then kind of result in all of the dynamics that I just highlighted earlier as it related to traditional kind of partner regional firm acquisition, right? So whether that regional firm is PE backed or independent, a lot of those things that we highlighted would hold. So if you are in that segment that PE would be interested in, let's say $15 million revenue from 20, et cetera, um, there is some flexibility in terms of deal dynamics, meaning you can roll some equity, you can own equity in the business post transaction. They will provide capital for growth and for acquisitions. So for your firm, right, if you're the acquiree, right, if you're the firm being acquired, private equity would provide capital for you to acquire firms and roll them into your business. Um, so thus the owners of the firm does have additional upside, right? Because they're maintaining equity. Normally that equity can result in one of the proponents of wealth creation. There's a moderate level of control in these types of transactions. Normally the private equity firm controls the board. They control, sometimes they're heavy handed and they control the operations day to day. Other times not. I think it depends on the partner and how involved they are. I think culture is a big thing here, as it relates to a relevant variable. you know, I don't want to paint with a broad brush. I have colleagues in the private equity space that I think are great guys. I think it just depends on kind of the firm that you ultimately meet and kind of how they conduct themselves. I think it's dangerous to paint with a broad brush, but I think that the industry overall has a negative connotation within the accounting space because people think, oh, look what happened in the healthcare space when private equity got involved, right? But I think that that's more of a nuanced conversation. But I do think that there's a brand perception there, and so if clients have a negative perception, then it's obviously it could be represent negatively on the firm. Next thing to highlight here is the individual CPA acquirer. This one's kind of self-explanatory. Effectively, if an individual CPA is looking to leave a big firm, wants to acquire a firm on their own, maybe they get an SBA loan, they acquire the firm. That doesn't result in the highest and valuation because naturally they're an individual acquirer. They don't have the bankroll of a large private equity firm or even a large accounting regional firm, right? So valuation kind of can trend accordingly. There's also not really much structural liberty here because the acquirer is an individual CPA, so they can't provide additional capital in most cases for the acquired firm to go do add-on acquisitions or to grow, right? Because they're limited in their capital source, especially if they're getting an SBA loan, which they can sometimes have to jump through hoops to even close. So due to this, there's really not a potential upside post-transaction for the seller. And there's very limited control because the buyer, the CPA buyer, individual buyer will be running the show post transaction. Hopefully, if the buyer is aligned with the seller, there's a good cultural kind of stability, and maybe that can maintain the brand. So, lastly, we'll highlight kind of what the Franklin Alliance is and how it represents something that's I think proliferating more in the space, in the accounting space and how it differs from the others. So we're an operating company. We're not a fund. So we do have venture capital and high net worth investor capital, which allows us to, pay fair valuations and not need to go like source capital for each individual deal, which is something that maybe an individual CPA would need to do. So we're similar to private equity in that case. But because our structure is different, we're more patient capital, which means that there's not going to be kind of short-term decision making that needs to be had, which I can kind of expound on further. But effectively, what that means is there's more flexibility. It allows for firm owners to own a significant piece of equity post the transaction, and it also provides for additional capital for a firm owner who might want to do acquisitions or grow inorganically. So therefore, there's a significant amount of upside for leadership of the firm, post a transaction or a partnership. And I think a big difference here as it relates to kind of traditional private equity is control and culture. So, with models like ours, our firm owners operationally run the firms, right? So the leaders of the firms have been running those firms in many cases for years. And we don't purport to know how to run their firm better than they do. We just we just want to add resources as business builders to help kind of support their efforts. So they kind of maintain the day-to-day operational control, which in some cases is very important to people. And that also influences culture because we're not going in like a regional firm would and requiring that in the first 90 days, you have to change softwares, change work from home policies, right? Change kind of culture in the office, right? Like that's something that I think, private equity backed firms traditionally kind of provide a bit of a stark transition, I would say. And that's something that we aim not to do because we think that culture is one of the most important things for small firms. And so that kind of relates to brand perception. We hope that by doing that, it can outline a favorable brand perception, which I think the first two firms that we partner with on the Franklin Alliance outline that pretty well because they're both second generation CPA firms. So, both of those gentlemen who run those firms, their fathers started the firm, years ago. Their last name is on the door, right? So, they care about legacy and culture and identity, right? And so those are things that um, I think we offer and made us a good partner for someone like that. So just to highlight here again, and people can kind of have the materials as they wish if they want to go back and look at all of this, but they're kind of key variables to consider. And you prioritize which variables are most important to you. And then you can kind of see which partner would be best if you're optimizing for any specific set of criteria. So this slide is just to highlight that it's important to understand what resources a potential partner, a private equity firm, a group like us, a regional firm, et cetera, what are they offering? Um, Things like recruiting, technology, organic revenue growth levers, acquisition support, succession planning, data management. Um, I think an important question is: have they helped other firms that are in similar size to your firm, right? And can you talk to those firms directly and understand what it's like for a firm in your segment, your size firm, to work with them? Have they maintained the culture, right? Have they preserved the legacy of the firm? Have they maintained the internal operations that you wanted to maintain? Can you keep the tech stack that's currently working? Will your working policies be maintained? Will you have operational control? An example of this is, will you be forced to get rid of clients that are paying less than a regional firm or a private equity backed firm's minimum $5,000 annual kind of tax compliance hurdle, right? Um, that can be, we've seen cases like that where things like that are enforced. I think it's important just to kind of understand some of those things going into it. This is just to highlight how these transactions are actually executed. It's something called an alternative practice structure, which effectively um, allows non CPAs to own and invest in a CPA firm, because there are limitations to the investor ownership. There's restrictions by law. So effectively, what investors do is they create a new company that's a non-attest firm, and then they have a services agreement with the attest firm, and that's what allows non CPAs to own and invest in accounting firms. This highlights the levers that an alliance partner like us can help you to maximize the value of your firm. Effectively, it just it's all about placing confidence in the leadership of the firm, that they have the resources to go out and sell new business, to service that business well at a high caliber, and not let quality of service degrade. Strategic partners can help firm owners work more kind of on the business rather than in the weeds of the business. We'll double click on this a little bit more in the next slide, but effectively, if you can leverage some of the resources and economies of scale to increase margins and grow, and then you attribute a higher multiple to that because you're part of a larger organization, can create some significant kind of wealth creation, which we'll double click on in the next slide. So here's an example, hypothetical example. Again, a very important slide, probably one of the most kind of important slides in the deck here. So here's a hypothetical example: $3 million revenue firm. The framework on the left is just like a status quo. Someone wants to run their firm for 5 years and then retire. They want to work for 3 to 4 years, and then they decide at that point that they want to retire. The buyer in that case might have some agita that the clients are going to transition or leave when the seller is no longer in place, because there wasn't a multi-year kind of smooth transition. So in that case, you'll see that here on the left, um, you know, the owner's salary will maintain kind of status quo, right? What they're used to kind of receiving from a compensation point of view. In year 5, when they want to transition, they'll receive some capital, but it will be a limited percentage of the value of the firm, because the buyer in that case will be, they'll have some trepidation around if the client base will stay, given that the owner, right, the relationship manager, is leaving. So what they normally will do is they'll give you a fraction kind of the value of the firm, and then pay you out the remainder based on the collections from the client base, kind of to hedge themselves. And so what that results in is the owner of the firm needing to wait another 5 to 10 years, right, in the worst case, to receive the rest of the capital. And the worst part about that is the owner's not in control of the client's service during that entire period. So it could degrade without, any blame of the owner because they've been transitioned away, right? And yet that impacts their kind of their payoff. So on the right, what we try to create is a way to keep the owner in control of client service and maximize the value of the firm, right? So you see here, sometimes it requires some reinvestment. So the salary could be similar or slightly lower, but the upfront cash that the person gets, right, is also kind of supported by by a deferred kind of payment annually, which allows the owner to pretty much extract the value of the firm each year while they're in control of the firm, right? So you get a portion of the capital up front for the the proportion of the business that you sold, and then you also collect deferred payments each year, which supports your cash flow, your personal cash flow. Um, and it also aligns kind of future incentives. And then moreover, um, you also, when you do want to step away, if it's in 5 years, for example, your the percentage ownership that you're selling in the business, right? It now ascribes a higher multiple because it's part of a firm. It's part of a larger firm, right? A platform like us, for example. So you therefore don't get that 3 times cash flow multiple that I talked about earlier, or 4 times cash flow multiple that an individual firm, right, with $3 million of revenue might trade at. You get a higher multiple because you're part of a bigger firm, and you don't have to wait for that payoff for multiple years while you're not in control of the business, right? So in this example, this hypothetical example of a $3 million firm, this basically results in the firm owner or ownership getting an additional $2 million and getting that money sooner while they're in control of the business. Here's a slide that just highlights strategic advisors for us. I think it's important just to note that um, it's good to know who's around the table in terms of whatever partnership or whatever private equity firm or group like us, alternative to private equity, et cetera. Um, you know, it, it's beneficial not to have to reinvent the wheel for everything. So what we aim to do is have someone on our strategic advisory board that has experience in kind of each step in a firm's journey. So, 0 to 5 million in revenue, 5 million to 15 in revenue, 15 million to 50 million in revenue. And then upwards to even gentlemen like Rick, who was the previous CEO of, a top firm in the US that's upwards of, you know, a lot more than that in revenue. So effectively, the goal is to not reinvent the wheel and lean on people that have maybe experienced some of the trials and tribulations of firm growth at whatever segment or stage that you are in terms of size. That's all we got. If anyone has questions or wants to learn more about private equity, about alternatives to private equity, feel free to hit us up. That's my email, steve@franklinalliance.co. You can check out our website at franklinalliance.co.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think that it was more than I expected, right? The depth and the complexity and the fragmentation of this whole ecosystem is so wild with all the options and what are the different like paths to arrive to a certain dot or a certain
Yeah.
point in the journey, right? In the journey of a firm owner. If there's no questions, which seems like people still need to digest and understand what they just learned and experienced. So if there's no questions, I strongly suggest for those of you who join and for those of you who will watch um the session later on YouTube, feel free to reach out to Steve. I think that one of the most amazing things with Steve is that he's accessible in levels that most VCs slash private equities are not. So reach out to him. I really encourage you to do that. And this, like I said, this will be uploaded to YouTube, and I hope to see everyone else in our future sessions. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you, Elad. It's a pleasure to be here, man.
Have a great one. Bye.